On the evening of September 2002, a film crew was finishing a day of shooting in the mountains of North Ossetia. As they prepared to leave, a low rumbling echoed through the mountain. At first it seemed distant and harmless, but when they turned toward the sound, they saw movement high on the slopes. What they were witnessing was the beginning of one of the deadliest glacier collapses ever recorded in modern history, and they were directly standing in its path. This is the story of the Kolka Glacier disaster. In the North Caucasus of Russia lies the Republic of North Ossetia Alania, a region shaped by its mountains. Nearly 700,000 people live here, most in the northern foothills, with the capital Vladikavkaz at the base of the range. For Ossetians, the peaks and the valleys are not just scenery, they define daily life and culture. South of the city, about 27 kilometers into the mountains, was the village of Karmadon. It sat in the narrow Karmadon Gorge, cut by the Ganaldon River and surrounded by steep cliffs. The gorge had long been both a home and a hazard for its residents. In earlier decades, Karmadon was more lively. It had a sanatorium, local jobs and hot springs that gave the village its name, Karmadon meaning warm water. The springs were a small attraction for visitors who came to bathe in the mineral-rich pools and enjoy the mountain setting. But by the late 20th century, Karmadon had entered a period of decline. The sanatorium closed, jobs dwindled and families moved away. With limited government support, infrastructure in the gorge fell into disrepair. Roads became rough and often impassable in bad weather, isolating the village further. By the early 2000s, many of Karmadon's houses stood abandoned. Only a few families remained, some living in a 5-story apartment building that had survived from the 1990s. Despite its dwindling population, the gorge still drew attention. Further up the valley lay the Kolka Glacier, tucked into the basin at the base of Mount Kazbek and the neighboring peak, Mount Dzhimara. For centuries, Kolka had been a defining feature of the gorge. Its meltwater fed the Ganaldon River, which in turn sustained life in the valley below. Residents were accustomed to its presence, aware of its shifting moods. The Kolka Glacier had a history of surges, sudden forward movements of the glacier mass, but these were generally gradual compared to what would unfold in 2002. Mount Dzhimara, which towers at 4,700 meters or about 15,600 feet, rises just north of the Kolka. It is the second highest peak in North Ossetia Alania and part of the Kak Range, itself a spur of the Greater Caucasus Mountains. Its slopes mark the border with Georgia. This whole section of the Caucasus is both strikingly beautiful and geologically active. Rockfalls, avalanches, and landslides are part of the natural rhythm here. People who live in these valleys learn to adapt to them. Yet, nothing in living memory compared to what was about to happen. On the evening of September 20, 2002, an event began that would forever change the history of the Karmadon Gorge. Yevgenia Pukova, a local resident who lived in the 5-story apartment building in the village, was inside her home that evening when she noticed something strange. She heard a sound she described as similar to a loud tractor. At first, she thought it might have been machinery somewhere in the valley, but then she noticed her cows behaving oddly. Instead of grazing, they began climbing up the slope, moving away from the lower pastures. Sensing something was wrong, she decided to follow them. About 10 minutes after she first heard the noise, the sound grew louder. The distant rumble became a deafening roar. Within moments, the upper section of the gorge was overwhelmed by a massive surge of ice, rock, water, and debris. By sheer instinct and perhaps by following the warning signs from her animals, she had moved to higher ground just before the surge reached the valley. Her decision spared her life. At 8:00 p.m. local time, a catastrophic failure occurred on the north-northeast wall of Mount Dzhimara. A massive block of rock estimated at 15 to 20 million cubic meters broke free and plunged nearly 1,000 meters down onto the Kolka Glacier. To give a sense of scale, that's about the size of a 70 to 80-story building made entirely of solid rock. The impact destabilized the glacier, and in moments, nearly the entire mass detached. In total, more than 125 million cubic meters of ice and rock were set in motion, transforming into a rock ice avalanche of staggering scale. Among those caught in the gorge that evening was a film crew led by Sergei Bodrov Jr. Bodrov was a prominent figure in Russian cinema. He had become a household name in the 1990s for his roles in the films Brother and Brother 2, movies that struck a chord with audiences across Russia. He was also recognized for his performances in Prisoner of the Mountains and East West. By 2002, Bodrov had moved into directing. His latest project, The Messenger, had brought him and his team to North Ossetia. The dramatic setting of the Karmadon Gorge was chosen for a filming location, its steep cliffs and rugged beauty serving as a backdrop for several scenes. On September 20, the crew spent the day shooting in the gorge. As evening fell and light faded, they began wrapping up production for the day. Equipment was being packed and vehicles prepared for departure when they heard a low rumble echoing through the mountains. Curious, some looked in that direction and saw a massive flow of rock and ice surging down the gorge towards them. Sergei and his film crew scrambled to get out of the way, but they were in the lower part of the valley, directly in the path of the surge. Within moments, Sergei and the entire film crew were buried in a massive flow of rock and ice. They were too deep within the gorge to even make it out in time. Rescue operations were launched immediately, but the devastation made them almost impossible. Roads leading into the gorge had been destroyed or buried, leaving helicopters as the primary way to access the area. Teams searched the debris fields, but the avalanche mass was immense. Blocks of ice and rock were piled dozens of meters thick, compacted so tightly that heavy machinery struggled to make progress. The chance of survival had already passed and recovery was equally difficult. Many families were forced to accept that their loved ones could not be retrieved. The official casualty lists 125 victims. 19 bodies were recovered in the weeks that followed, while 106 remained missing. Among those missing were about 42 people connected with the film crew, including Bodrov himself, crew members and performers from a North Ossetian theater who were assisting with the production. No one in the film crew survived and ever recovered. Authorities, however, acknowledged that the true number of lives lost may have been higher. At that time, undocumented migrants from other regions of the Caucasus had been living and working in the gorge. Because their presence were not officially recorded, some may have perished in the avalanche without ever being added to the victim list. For this reason, the exact death toll will likely never be known. Experts noted that most of the victims were entombed under layers of solidified ice and rock, in some places buried dozens of meters deep. The conditions made recovery nearly impossible. In fact, many of the bodies are likely to remain beneath the glacier until significant melting occurs, a process that could take years or even decades. For the families, this meant not only the loss of loved ones, but also the painful knowledge that the remains may never be recovered. For the Russian film industry, the loss of Bodrov Jr. was deeply felt. He had been seen as one of the most promising young directors of his generation. His earlier acting career had already established him as a cultural figure, and his shift into directing was highly anticipated. The tragedy cut short a career that many expected would continue to shape Russian cinema for decades. In Ossetia and across Russia, the disaster became a national tragedy, remembered both for the loss of local residents and for the fate of the film crew. Scientists later estimated that 125 to 130 million cubic meters of ice and rock were displaced in those first minutes. The avalanche roared down the Karmadon Valley at speeds of up to 150 to 200 kilometers per hour, or 93 to 124 miles per hour. From the upper basin to the gates of Karmadon, a distance of about 18 to 20 kilometers, the mass traveled in just 6 to 10 minutes. Beyond that, the debris and mud carried by the flow continued another 10 kilometers farther down. Altogether, the runout exceeded 30 kilometers, making it one of the most powerful glacial avalanches ever documented in history. The scale was almost unimaginable. Along the valley walls, the avalanche left run-up marks 140 meters high. In some places, the ice front rose more than 120 meters. Roads, bridges, and entire villages were buried. The village of Nizhny Karmadon disappeared beneath tons of ice, rock, and mud. For survivors farther down, the signs were sudden and confusing. Some recalled hearing a continuous roar, like distant thunder that never stopped. Others said they first saw a pale white cloud, a mix of dust, vapor, and ice crystals, moving rapidly down the gorge. For some, the noise seems strangely muted, as though cushioned by the powder cloud. Regardless of how it was perceived, the avalanche arrived with devastating speed, giving residents little or no time to flee. Temporary lakes form as debris blocked drainage. Near the village of Gornaya Saniba, water levels rose more than 2 meters and remained high for weeks until a natural outlet eventually released the flood. These secondary hazards compounded the disaster, flooding homes and adding uncertainty to rescue efforts. Scientists studying the disaster concluded it was the result of combined factors: long-term glacial fragility, the massive rockfall from Dzhimara, possible geothermal heating linked to the region's volcanic activity, and local seismic activity all contributed to the chain of events. Together, they triggered one of the most powerful rock ice avalanches ever documented in the Caucasus. What made the collapse even more tragic is that it had been building for years. The Kolka Glacier was known to be unstable, with earlier surges recorded in the 20th century, most notably in 1969, when the glacier advanced several kilometers in a matter of months. Scientists had also noted geothermal heat rising through the valley and minor seismic activity in the years leading up to 2002. These factors had been slowly weakening the glacier's base and increasing internal stress. The catastrophic detachment in September was not just a single accident of nature, but the final stage of a long process that had been unfolding quietly for decades. Even if the massive rockfall from Mount Dzhimara had never occurred, Kolka's condition meant that a collapse was inevitable. The glacier was already unstable enough that at some point it would have broken apart under its own weight and internal pressures. The rockfall simply hastened what was about to happen. The aftermath left long-term consequences. The Kolka Glacier itself had been almost completely destroyed. In the years since, it has begun slowly to reaccumulate, but scientists remain cautious. With climate change altering glacial behavior worldwide, the future of Kolka Glacier remains uncertain. Its instability continues to pose risks for the valley below, and monitoring of the glacier has become a priority for geologists in the region. For the people of North Ossetia, Alania, the Karmadon disaster is not just a scientific event, but a collective memory. At the gates of Karmadon, a memorial now stands. It commemorates not only the film crew, but all the residents and visitors who lost their lives. Each year, people come to pay respects, leaving flowers, photographs, and candles at the site. The glacier remains silent, but beneath its surface are the lives cut short on that September evening. They remain frozen under layers of ice, rock, and history, reminder of the power of the mountains and the fragility of those who live in their shadow. That's it for the video. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I would really appreciate it if you can support the channel so that one day I can offer you a much better experience. Have a good, wonderful day or night, and I will see you in the next video.